we need somebody in your generation to continue the traditional style of call making, because right now it's going away. There could be a lot more. I know of 6 to 8 traditional call makers that stick to traditional woods, traditional style of call making, drill, chisel, things like that. Much more difficult. Much more difficult.
What are you here to learn today?
Anything I can. I don't make box calls, so I'm just here to learn a little bit more about him. He's one of the old school guys. Without him, none of us would be here, him and his generation.
Well, just wanting to find out more information that may help us as entrepreneurs to just want to maybe learn a little more skill and maybe something that'll help us and give us some insight of call making. Maybe one day it'll help inspire us to want to make some things to improve what we're doing and trying to do.
What are you here to learn from Lamar today?
Well, I'd say any little nugget you learn. I really don't know, but I'd say any little nugget you learn from this guy is pretty much solid gold.
I've been asking around some of the box call makers that are here at the show, and I decided when I heard about this seminar I was going to come and watch this guy explain how he makes a box call. I figure the more I can learn, the better the box will be.
I appreciate y'all coming. How many of you here, I'm just curious, how many of you are call makers or would like to be call makers, not necessarily indulge in it full time, but just start out making? Okay, out of y'all, how many of y'all are interested in making friction calls, making box calls, paddle calls? That dwindled quite a bit, didn't it? I'm going to tell you pretty much how I got started in it and what the early days were like, and probably tell you some stories. Probably going to take, I don't know, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, something like that, maybe. And then if you've got any questions, I'll be glad to answer your questions the best I can. But I started making calls in 1978, and let me say this first. Numbers or dates, not important to me. It's just back then when I don't know how many turkeys I killed. I don't know how many deer I've killed. I just don't keep up with that, never have. Some of my calls, early calls, like these up here, some of them are dated. I've got some at home, same style of calls back then, and they're not dated. And why I didn't date them, I don't know. It wasn't important. But it seems to be an important thing now to a collector. The earlier you made the call, the earlier the call is, the seems to place more importance on the call, and in some cases, depending on the maker, brings a different price, a better price. So I started in '78. I started out making wing bone calls and scratch boxes, and I didn't have like most of you, my time was limited. I had a full-time job. I worked with the railroad. I was in the National Guard. I spent 31 years in the National Guard. And little did I realize when I started how much time that would require, because the more calls that I made, the longer I stayed in it and doing it, the more time it required. But I'll touch on that in a little bit. Started out making, like I say, those style of calls. And as most of you know, there was no internet back then. It was feet on the ground, getting your vehicle. And I had about 8 or 10 stores within a 100-mile radius of me that I would call on these stores to see if they were interested in carrying my turkey calls. And some did, some didn't, but that's okay. I still had about 8 or 10 of those types of stores that were interested in my calls. And back then also, if it was a small county fair or a forest festival, even went to a rattlesnake roundup, if I couldn't go, I would send my son and a friend of mine, and they would go to those shows. And my whole purpose back then was to get my name before the people. And it was, Turkey, it's nothing like it is now. I went to my first convention. Back then, the state of Florida had conventions. I went to my first one in '78. It was down in Winter Park, which is close to Orlando. I saw Neil Cost there. I saw Louis Stowe there. I even asked Louis Stowe where to get slate from, and he told me. And but I didn't, I wasn't making calls at that time. I had actually made my first turkey call with a scratch box in high school shopping when I was in 10th grade. And I was 15 years old at that time. But I didn't make another turkey call till I was in I think I was 31 or 32, something like that. I didn't have the time working with the railroad and involved with the garden and all that. Family always comes first, did back then, although there was a time that I stayed in my shop a whole lot more than I needed to, but it was just part of it. Sometimes I'll regress and I'll lose my train of thought, so I have to pick up where I was. But anyway, the next year they had the Florida State Convention in Gainesville. I was a member of the Gainesville chapter of the Turkey Federation that time. We sponsored that convention that year, and back then it was just like it is here. Even Louis Stowe, Dick Kirby, Perfection, Jim Clay, a lot of the guys, they hadn't been in making calls very long either, so they were looking for exposure as well, and they were trying to go to every show that they could go to. But I met Neil at that convention in '79. I just talked to him, just like one of y'all might come by and talk to me at my booth, and that was pretty much it. The next year, in '80, it was the same thing. Neil came, and I just talked to him briefly. There was no friendship struck at that time. But let me back up for just a minute. In '79, when I first met him, my family and I were camping at the fairgrounds. That's where the convention was held. And it was just breaking daylight, and I heard an owl hoot. And I had a pop-up camper, and I look out my window, and here's this guy walking across the fairgrounds, hooting like an owl, and he's calling on diaphragm call. And I told Justin, my son, I said, I don't know who that is, but I'm going to meet that guy. So when we went into the building, Neil was going up to get coffee. And I talked to him a little bit later, and so forth and so on. Back 1981, they moved the convention to Tallahassee. And I visited with him more. And I mean, we talked. Neil's first wife had passed away, and he was there with a friend. But I invited him to go fishing with me. I had access to some of the sand pits around where I lived that was loaded with bass. So I asked him if he wanted to go fishing. So he said sure. So when we left Tallahassee, they checked into the Holiday Inn where I live in Stark, and the next morning I picked him up and it was raining. And I told him, I said, Neil, I don't know how this is going to work out, but we'll give it a try. So we did. We did not catch a fish. We got soaking wet, but he was there the whole time. And anyway, he left, and I made contact with him sometime later that year, and that continued. But let me regress for just a minute. I'd started making box calls somewhere around that time, '81, and I was making this style of call, and the name of my call company was Widowmaker Turkey Calls. And I don't remember the year, but sometime later, Ben Lee came out with a tube call, and he called it the Widowmaker. Well, I'd been to the courthouse and when I started making calls and registered that name, but I saw what he did and I knew how big he was in turkey calls, so I said I need to do something. So I changed the name of my call company to my name, and which has worked out fine. But my association with Neil, this young man right here, I was speaking with him a little bit earlier before this started. He wants to make box calls. I would call Neil or he would call me 80, 81, 82, long in there sometime, and we became friends. When we go on vacation up to North Georgia here, Black Rock Mountain right up here, not too far from here, we'd always go back through South Carolina and visit with Neil for any time we came up here. But we became good friends, and I would come hunt with him. I'd come up, my son and I would come up and hunt deer with him, come up and hunt turkey with him. He'd come to Florida hunt with me. And he told me after I had started making these style of calls that he didn't think that I would stick with him on making calls. He had had several people, he told me at that point, that had wanted to make calls, but they didn't come back. They came once or twice and that was it. So I was just another one of those people to him that had, you know, except I lived 6.5 hours away. I wasn't local. So I started, I was continuing making this style of call, and he called me, and I don't remember when it was, 88, 87, 88, 89, something like that. I was at work, and he called me, and he said, I need to talk to you about something. And I said, okay, what you want to talk about? He says, I can't tell you on the phone. I said, so you want me to drive 6.5 hours to see you so you can tell me something? He says, that's right. I said, okay. So I took off work the next couple of days. My wife and I drove to Greenwood and got there about 10 or 11 o'clock that night. And the next morning, the girls had gone shopping, and he and I was sitting around the bar in his house drinking coffee. And I said, what in the world was it so important? What was so important that you wanted me to come up here? You couldn't tell me on the phone. He says, I want you to start checkering box calls. I said, Neil, that's you, that's not me. I said, I'm content doing what I'm doing, making plain-sighted calls. He says, well, I don't have anybody to leave this to. But, you know, I got 2 daughters, and they aren't interested in it. I got 2 grandsons, they aren't interested in it. I'd have people come here that want to help, they want me to help them make calls. They didn't come back, and so forth and so on. I said, well, the first thing that's going to happen is that somebody's going to say, I'm going to be at Unicoi, and somebody's going to say, you copied Neil calls. He said, they probably will. But there's one difference. He says, I'm giving you permission. I haven't given anybody else permission to do that. Now, up here, I don't know when this was, 80, 85, 86, something like that. Vendors weren't here, vendors were out there, and there was a guy right over here. He had checkered calls on his table. He had his old hen pattern, single check calls on his table. And I saw Neil go over there to him and tell him to get those calls off the table. He had a design patent on that style of call. And the guy took them off of his table. And you know, that's something that I told him, and he says, well, I says, okay. I says, you're going to have to give me written permission, because somebody's going to, not that it matters, you're giving me permission, I can go with that, but people are going to talk. He says, well, I don't care about those people. Well, I don't care. I just want you to check your calls. I don't have anybody else to leave it to. I said, okay. So we went out to Neil's shop, and he drew out the patterns on the blocks. He already had the blocks out there. He drew the patterns on the blocks, drew all 3 checkering patterns. He says, and he showed me how to get started. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. So he says, I'm going to house watch television. When you get through, you bring them inside. I said, okay. So I checkered the 3 calls. I messed up on one of them, but anyway, I took the 3 calls, the 3 blocks into his house and gave them to him. And he says, well, that didn't take you too long. I said, no. And I had a checkering pattern. You know, the 2-check pattern that I make now, that's his pattern. That's made with 1/2-inch checks. I had made a call, I had checkered one of the calls with a 3/4-inch check. So it was an elongated 2-check. Rather than a 1/2 inch, it was 3/4 of an inch. And he says, I've never done that design before. He says, that's your design. He says, you can have that. You can have my design and you can do your design. I said, okay. So I started, he gave me, I changed my call somewhat. I did not want to make a call exactly like Neil made. So I changed it, I shortened my call, I changed the radius. He gave me his patterns. I've still got them in my shop today. He gave me all of his patterns that he had, and I made some of those calls, the early calls, using some of his patterns, and then I changed it, and I got a different radius now. And Neil's calls back then were approximately 7 3/4, 7 inches long, and mine, I reduced mine to like 7 5/8. And it would shorten the sound chamber, which would bring the pitch up, and it worked for me. But I started going, at that point, I started going to 2 more shows. I would come up here to this show, and I would go to the Southeast Wildlife Expo in Charleston in the late 80s, no, actually it was early 80s. It was 84, I think, 85, somewhere along there. I went to the first Wildlife Expo in Charleston. It was a good show for me. But at that time, too, when I was making turkey calls, I got to regress again. I was also making rattlesnake belts and buckles. I was also making fishing rods. So it was so time consuming that I had to stop something. So I stopped making the belts and buckles and stopped making rods. So I stuck with the turkey calls. And I'm glad that I did. That was a lot better direction for me to go than where I was going with all 3. And a lot of, just took so much time to do all of that. But my time with Neil, I was friends with him until he passed in '02. We hunted together, we fished together. But one thing he taught me more than anything probably was wood selection. On what wood grain to pick out, how to pick it out, what to look for, color to look for in your different woods that you were using, particularly black walnut. That's a critical factor when you're making traditional calls. Most of you know, if all of you don't do, I just make traditional calls. I stick with traditional woods for paddles, walnut, cherry, maple. If I could get my hands on some beech, I'd probably make some with beech, but I can't. It's too difficult dealing with hardwood dealers to get the wood grain that you want. And then I stick with the domestic woods on the bodies of the calls. Now, I have made 2 calls, used two woods that were exotics. One was limba, and the other one was sapelli. I think it was 4 calls out of sapelli, and I made 5 or 6 calls, something like that, out of limba. And that's here recently. That's in the last 3 or 4 years. But I've stuck with the traditional woods because, in my opinion, we're losing traditional call making. A lot of call makers now are using exotics, which is fine. I don't have any issues with that, and not that it would matter. They make good calls, but I just choose to stay with traditionals because there's only a handful of traditional call makers now, and that's important to me because it seems like we progress in this country into different areas of life. We lose the old ways, and I think that's a travesty in some cases, and I don't want to see that go away. So you got people like Darren that's continuing in the traditional style of call making. You've got others here that continue in this, that are in the traditional style of call making. But in making calls, the 2 or 3 of you that was interested in making calls, and I've already asked you, but you know, you're gonna need basic equipment, and you know, you're gonna need a table saw, you're gonna need a band saw, you'll need a drill press, you'll need a router with a router table, you'll need drill bits, you'll need chisels. Everything I do, once I drill a call out, from that point on, it's all hand done with chisels. I use a 3/4 inch chisel to get the call down to where I'm going to put it on my bench to work it. And when I get on my bench, then I use a 1/2 inch chisel to tune the call, that and sandpaper and a scraping knife. But wood selection is so important. The grain structure, the density of the wood has got everything to do with the tonal quality of that particular call that you're trying to make. Give you an example, butternut. Butternut, as most of you know, was hit by a blight a number of years back. It's hard to get, hard for me to get. Butternut, in my dealings with butternut, I've had a lot of butternut on the soft side. And it does, to me, it does not make good calls. But if you can get butternut that is a medium density, that's hard, it makes great calls. Yellow poplar makes great calls, if you can find yellow poplar. Mineral poplar's a little bit denser than yellow poplar, and it's a little bit harder to work with. Walnut makes great calls. Cherry makes great calls. I even, from time to time, I'll make calls using cherry paddles. And I like that sound. I have made some calls using maple. Haven't made many maple paddles for calls. But anyway, when you decide you want to make calls, there's just some basic decisions you've got to make on what you want to make. You're going to make scratch boxes, or you're going to make, which is fine, or you're going to make box calls, you're going to make paddle boxes, or you're going to make handle boxes. I made my first handled box. I thought I made it in '87, and I looked at this one right here that I made. That's made in '86. This was made in '83. This particular call here, Neil had come down to hunt with me, and I was in my shop, and I had that call laying on the table in my shop, and he says, "Watch this," and I says, it's a box call with a handle on it. It doesn't have a bottom on it. And he ran it, and he says, "Man, I like that." I says, "Well, good." I'd kill 3 gobblers with it. I think that's the only call I ever notched. But I'd kill 3 gobblers with it, and next thing I know, I don't know exactly how much time passed, he was making a call he calls a doodat call. A doodat call is a small paddle call. Darren makes one. They're difficult calls to make. When you've got a call designed like a paddle call that's 12 inches, 12 and a half inches long, whatever, and you reduce the size of it, you reduce the size of a box call, it's going to be harder to tune, because there's certain parameters that sound chamber has got to be. And if it's not, you'll be able to tell it's going to be too high pitched, it's going to be all high pitched, it won't roll over, just different things. But probably one of the hardest calls to me to make is that short paddle call. I've only tried to make 2 or 3. I just quit with it. I didn't need to pursue that. I just stuck with paddle calls. And I continued to make paddle calls. I don't make many handle boxes anymore. I started making them back then. I didn't sell a handle box until 2000. And I sold 4. Darren bought one of those 4 handle boxes when I was at the Charlotte National Convention. I didn't make another one until 2010. And from 2010 till present time, I've I've probably made 50 or 60 of those calls, something like that. I didn't make any last year, but it's just something that people ask me about making them, and I'll put them on a list. It's like one-siders, very difficult call for me to make. I don't make one-siders until I get orders for 4, 5, or 6 calls, because when I'm set up doing all that, it's just as easy for me to go ahead and drill out those 5 or 6 as it is that one, and take all the time to make the paddles for it, because with me, I never make one paddle for a call. If I'm working a dozen calls in the shop, I'll make 24 or 30 paddles, because they're all going to sound different. And when you finally find the one that'll match what you've been tuning, that's the call you're going to stick with. Then you got to fine tune it. Then you got to start. You might have to chisel out a little bit more. You might have to use a scraping knife on it. You might have to sand it. You might have to do all of that to get what you're looking for. And wood will fool you. Neil said one time, told me one time, he says, wood is the most unforgiving thing made by one of those unforgiving natural things made. And he says, it's just, you never know what it's going to give you. So, and I believe that, because wood, like I say, wood will fool you. I've had difficult time getting black walnut, getting good black. I can buy black walnut pretty much any place, but I can't get good black walnut. Darren and I were visiting Billy Bice in July, and when we got through our visit with Billy, the next day we went to a lumber company over there close to where he lives. I'd bought lumber there before. We went through 1,500 board feet of black walnut that was select grade, and bought 6 boards. I would have bought 15 boards if they were in those stacks of wood, but they were not. But it's just wood. Yellow poplar's hard for me yet. I think I mentioned that earlier, but it's just, you know, and you get a black walnut board for paddles. You can figure that 60 to 65% of that board will be good for paddles. The balance of that board, you can make bottoms out of it, or you can make bodies out of it if the grain is suitable. So all that is important when you're making calls. That's pretty much it. If y'all got any questions, something I didn't cover.
If you don't mind, when somebody asks you, because you can't hear it on this because you've got the lav mic on, just repeat, just say they asked me about wood grain selection or whatever, and then answer the question. You don't care? You understand?
You want me to?
If they ask you a question, just say, so he asked me this, that way the camera can hear it.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Let me say one thing that I overlooked. There's pros and cons to call making. You know, the good side of call making is that I have met a lot of people in call making. I've got great friends that came through call making. Darren's one of them. Jerry Loudermilk's one of them. Lewis Sapp's one of them. But and it's great, and it's great. The places I've got to hunt, I've had invites to hunt all kind of great places. I didn't take up the invitation in a lot of cases. I don't travel a lot turkey hunting, but I have been to some of these places. I've had the opportunities to hunt with governors, U.S. senators, Secretary of States for this country, golf pros, Davis Love. But the plus side of it has been good. The money can be good, but if you're going into it for the money, you don't need to go into it, because that's a losing proposition. You got to go into it for the love of it, and for no other reason than that. The downside of it is this: it takes tremendous amount of time away from your family. I've got a great wife. I've been married 58 years. Not one time has she ever complained. She used to hunt with me early on. I've got a son, a daughter, 2 grandsons, 2 granddaughters. My grandsons, one of my grandsons hunts. He's like me or his daddy, Justin. My other grandson, he can take it or leave it. It's okay, and that's okay with me too. But the time that it takes away from your family can be tremendous. I've been working on calls to come to this show since September. But I also have family obligations that I've got that I couldn't spend a lot of time in my shop. That's why I started so early. That I can only get to my shop maybe a couple hours a day, some days not at all, since September. But that's okay. That's just the nature of the beast, and I deal with it. I like working in my shop. But there is a downside to it, and early on I didn't really pay any attention to that downside. I just continued to do what I did, and praise the Lord, it didn't take a toll on me because my wife had adequate reasons to move on because I wasn't around a lot. If I wasn't hunting or fishing, I was in the shop making calls, and she was great. I got a great wife. What was about the wood selection?
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying if somebody asks you a question, just repeat what they asked you so
Okay.
the camera can hear it.
Okay. Any questions?
I'm kind of curious, back in the day when you couldn't buy slate, on the internet, from these vendors that sell it, where did y'all get it?
Lewis had told me, this was early on, this is when I was making handheld slates, corncob strikers.
Right.
There was a company called Penn Big Bed. It was in Pennsylvania. You ordered sheet slate. Now you couldn't order 10 pieces of sheet slate. You had to order 200 pieces of sheet slate. So they sent you a whole container. So you couldn't hardly pick the doggone thing up. And that's what I started out using. And I made a number of calls. I've still got some of that slate. Then I went to pot calls. Probably in 89, 90, something like that. I would buy pot calls from Mike Batty. I would buy the calls from him, then I would turn around and resell them. Well, that went on for about, and when I order calls from Mike Batty, I'm talking about ordering 50 calls. I'm not talking about ordering hundreds and hundreds of calls. I would order them from him that 1 year, and I didn't even realize that till I was trying to pick out some of these calls to bring, and I found some of those slate calls in my stash in my foot lockers and so forth. I got all my calls stored in, and I called Mike about it. And back then he was making that particular pot for Butsky. So anyway, and when I went to making pot calls, I would order the pots from Mike. Pot would come with a tone board. I would get slate from a person named John Hunt, who was in Pennsylvania. Most of the call makers in this country, be it, the big time call makers, Primos, H.S. Strutt, whomever, Nightingale, they were getting slate. If they were making their calls, they were getting slate from John Hunt. Quaker Boy was getting slate from John Hunt. I talked to Dick about that back then. He had the pot call slate market cornered. But John, I don't remember how long he was in business, but for a number of years, that's the way it was. For probably, 10 or 15 years, Darren, something like that. And then you started, I can't think of those brothers' name that you can get it from now, but now you can buy pieces of slate on the internet. You don't need to order like I'd order from John. If I ordered 100 pots from Batty, I'd order 120 pieces of slate from John Hunt. And it was every year. You just keep doing the same thing and same thing. I was also getting the heads for the strikers from Mike. and I was using hickory for strikers. I had to order, I still got hickory rods from my initial order. I don't know, you had to, I forget what it was, 150 or 200 hickory rods, 36 inches long, you know, things like that. You just cut off a piece of them. But anyway, it was a lot different back then than it is now. You have access now to so much that I didn't have access to back then. Yes, sir?
I had a question for you. Maybe you could expound. I know you touched on black walnut a lot. I know you use it a lot. It makes a fantastic call, but maybe you could touch a little bit more on the wood grain, maybe the color of it. I know, like, I've been building calls for a couple of years. It's one of the more difficult ones to secure a good piece that will actually produce a good sound, you know, for these call makers that are starting out.
Well, I didn't understand this.
To ask him again.
Just
about black walnut, if there was any more that you could describe about wood grain or the color of the black walnut that produces a quality sound in your wood. I've discovered that it's one of the more difficult ones to get a quality piece of wood out of.
He's asking you for grain selection.
What are you looking for?
What are you looking for?
What are you
Grain
looking for when
selection.
you're picking out your black walnut?
I was asked, what am I looking for when I pick out the black walnut? I'm looking for color. I want 8/4, 2-inch thick wood, at least 2 inches. Whether the board is 6 inches wide, 8 inches wide, 10 inches wide, doesn't really matter. I would prefer that end grain, that those rings would be 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 inch apart. I don't want anything 1/4 of an inch. I would buy it because it works. But I look for the straight grain because on that 2-inch side. And the color I look for, I like the brownish gray color. You're going to get walnut sometime that has black streaks in it. I haven't found that to work very well. So, but that's hard to pick. You can't pick that out in the rough. It's just too difficult. And I haven't been to any place buying walnut that it was planed unless you went to their bin, where they've got it planed to 1 13/16, and I just don't want that. I would buy a piece of that if it met my requirements, but I've only ran across 1 or 2 pieces that would do that. So I buy it in the rough, but that 2-inch side's got to be straight grain. You also look for weight. Now I can't describe weight to you. It's just, there's just a certain weight that you look for. You can't really read the end grain on wood from these hardwood dealers because it's painted. So you're pretty much looking at that 2-inch side. You're looking at that 8-inch side or top of that, and you're seeing if it's got any swirls in it, if it's got any knots in it, and so forth. You want clear, if you can possibly get it. There again, it's difficult to find. But I look for ideally, and you can't tell it for the most part, but I look for the end grain to be oval-shaped quartering. And I look for the first cut after the sapwood, or the second cut after the sapwood, depending on the size of the board. Sapwood, if there's just a small amount of sapwood on a paddle, it doesn't hurt it. In fact, it probably adds to it as far as someone buying that call, because they like that. It's prettier. And turkey call buyers tend to like pretty over function, over sound. If you don't, look at trumpet calls, right? They want desert ironwood. They want, something that's really pretty. And that's good. I think in that case, a lot of calls sell because they're pretty. They buy, But, that sound is what you need to look for. Yes, sir?
The number of checkerings on the side of a box, lid of a box, does that affect, like the 1 row versus, say, 20, like the 20 checks? Does that affect sound?
Yeah. I'm being asked if the checkering on the side of a call affects the sound of the call. Yes, it does. You're removing wood out of almost the entire length of that tone board. So anytime you're removing wood, you're going to change the sound of that call. To me, I prefer the single check. That's about all I make is single check. I do make 2 and 3 checks if a customer requests that at an additional expense. But it does affect it. I make sometimes chestnut. Sometimes you can get chestnut that I checker most chestnut, but sometimes depending on and it's an individual board deal. You've got to know what you're dealing with. Sometimes it can be too soft. Butternut's the same way. A lot of butternut doesn't make good calls because it's too soft. But if you happen to find a piece that would work, I don't checker it. I just make it plain side. I think a plain sided call. I think a groove sounding call sounds just as well. I think the groove sided calls, and that probably pretty much depends on the size of the groove and the location of the groove as to what that call is going to sound like, because essentially you're doing the same thing by doing that, by cutting that groove in there, depending on the size of that groove. So yes, it does affect the sound of the call. To me, checkering to a small degree mellows the call. I like checker. I like plain-sided calls, but a plain-sided call at a walnut would be more difficult to make than a checkered call out of walnut, to me. Or cherry. It would be the same thing.
You've got a lot of call makers in this room that's well respected in their own crafts and everything else, and I think they respect you as a sense, and they're in here. What is the common thing that you see a mistake that your fellow call makers probably make that you've learned through the years that hey, watch out for this. This is a common theme I see in your tuning, whatever it may be. Can you say what that is? Like the most noticeable thing that in calls that you see?
Well, most of the call makers I know have been making calls for a long time, and they work most of the bugs out of their calls. I was yesterday. This was not a call. It was just a call maker. A gentleman that's out here. He was making calls, and he asked me if I would critique his calls. And sometimes somebody thinks they want you to critique their calls. Well, I'm going to tell somebody what I think. Good, bad, or indifferent, doesn't matter. I'm going to be honest with you. So I've made some suggestions to him. I said, you need to change. You got too much depth in this call. You need to make some changes in your end block. Radius was good. His paddle was good. This particular guy was using exotics for a paddle. A lot of weight difference in exotics. Exotics, a foot of black walnut weighs about 3.15, 3.25 pounds per board foot. Piece of Purple Heart or some of the other woods that a lot of them are using, 4.25, 4.50. It's a considerable amount of difference in that weight. So I suggested to him that if he can find some good walnut or some good cherry, try that for his calls. And he was receptive to it. He and I had talked a little bit. I think it was last year or the year before he was up here. But you've got to be willing to make changes. I've worked with a call maker that's close to me, and about some, just shared different things with him and he with me. Larry Stevens, and Larry's a good friend of mine. Larry he makes good calls. But he we'll just share stuff back and forth, but I'll make suggestions. I'm terrible about, well, why don't you do this? I give people advice, they don't ask for it. You know, and those people that I know like that, they take it in stride. They don't, you know, they appreciate it. I can't, it's like Darren, I can't think of anything I could tell Darren about what to do to his call. He's got his sound, I've got my sound, and that's what's unique about call making, is that we all have our different sounds. And Darren and I talk a lot about calls, about call making, about all things associated with call making. But I'm willing, you know, I'm willing to help anybody. I don't have any secrets. Somebody can look at my call and you can take measurements and you can, everything there is, it's right there before you, just take measurements. But I go back to this, the hardest thing you're gonna deal with is wood selection. If you don't have good quality wood, you're not gonna make a good turkey call. Neil came out with a tape through the Georgia chapter back in the 80s. And I think it was it might have been the same title of his book, Making Calls in the Gobbler Shop or Making Box Calls or something. Some of you have seen it. I don't know if it's still available. For those who want to learn how to make a box call, that is a great resource for making calls. If it's still available. You could order it through the Georgia chapter, but I don't know if it's still available anymore. Any other questions?
On average, what does it take you from start to finish with the tuning and everything to make one of your calls?
When I take everything into consideration for what I have to do, I'm talking about getting the wood, making the call, how much time it takes to tune, because some calls are more difficult to tune than others. I mean, it's not uncommon for me to swap paddles 6 or 8 times, you know, and normally it takes me 4 to 6 hours to make a call. It is very time consuming. It takes me 20 to 25 minutes once I've finished a call to sand it. Just sand it, not counting putting the finish on it. Yeah, that's the looks of the call to me is as important as the sound of the call. Yeah, Darren.
Would you agree that to call makers starting out, they shouldn't disregard the calls that do not work out for them? Wouldn't you recommend to hold on to that call as a comparison to the ones that do work out for you and use that as a learning tool?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Darren asked me if I thought the people just starting out making calls, even though they weren't pleased with those calls, that they need to hold on to them. Use it as a learning curve for the calls they'll come up with one day they'll be pleased with. And I do agree with that, yes. Yes. You and I both have I have burned hundreds and hundreds of calls. Some of them I could have sold. People would buy them. But with me, they have got to have a certain tone and pitch, or I'm not going to sell it. If anybody ever buys a call from me and they get it and they don't like it, let me be the first person you call. I'll give you your money back. I'll pay for your return shipping. I'll make you another call. Whatever you want to do. But that's very important as a learning curve to me.
How much satisfaction do you get as a traditional call maker going from traditional call making, and this is staying within the same bounds, as walking away from what you know and walking into creating a Williams box? I mean, stopped what you were doing and you threw all that knowledge away because you didn't have a knowledge of a Williams box, correct?
Yeah. Darren's referring to a call that I came up with in 2016. And I marketed that call to just certain people. And I did not want that style of call out before the public. I didn't want to bring that call here and put on my table and sell them. It took me 7 years to come up with that call. Working on my calls, doing whatever I do, thinking about it, taking the time when that struck me, because I had this sound in my head of what this call should sound like. I know what a turkey sounds like, and we're all tuning calls to that turkey in our head. Anyway, it took me 7 years. So in 2016, I came up with this call. It is a straight wall call, like a turpin. And it is, I run an exotic paddle on it. Bear in mind that Turpin boxes, Gibson boxes, Denison boxes used exotic paddles, exotic wood paddles. Turpin used Aramith, which is Purple Heart. So you're sticking with traditional call making when you run straight wall boxes with exotic paddles. You aren't getting in the tall weeds. So the Williams box was a challenge for me. Once I devoted the time to it, quit doing everything else, quit making calls, spent as much time in the shop as I could. It took me probably 3 or 4 months working steady, trying to. I was doing other things, you know. I mean, we all got honeydews and everything, right? I mean, when I could get in my shop. My grandson Tate was in there with me during a lot of this period. He was there when I came up with that box. But when you start with something like that, it's the same thing whether you're making a call style, inch style box, doesn't matter. You got to stay within certain parameters. And I had never made a straight wall box. So the only straight wall boxes I own were Billy Bice, and I haven't seen them in several years. I don't know what I did with them. I hope they're in my shop stored away somewhere, but I haven't seen Billy's calls that I bought in the late 80s here. So I didn't have anything else to look at and see, and look at how high it was, how long it was, how short it was, whatever, the internal dimensions. So I was just going from scratch. So I started out drilling. I started out with walnut. I've got some walnut that was not suitable for paddles. Makes good box calls. And I started out making them, trying out that walnut and trial and error. You know, once you make one, you can't just run one paddle on it and say, well, that don't sound right. So you got to reach up and get another paddle. Well, I had access to East Indian rosewood, Babinga, and Jatoba, which is cherry. Cherry. So and it's dense. All those are dense woods. So I'd have to cut out paddles. You know, make paddles with a block plane and a sander. You know, and I made thousands of them like that. But anyway. So it was very time consuming. That's why there was such a time element there. It's just having to do all this stuff and changing sizes, changing depth, changing the size of the end blocks and so forth. All that was critical to the sound. But I finally got what I wanted. And I think it was in May of 2016. And I made several of them to see, and I wanted to see which paddle was going to run the best on them. So I finally settled on Babinga for a paddle, and So I started making some. I called Darren, ran it for Darren, and Darren says it's the best box call I ever heard in my life. I said, okay, thank you. So I brought it up here. I brought 2 or 3 of them up here in 2017 and showed them to some people that were not call makers. One of them was a call maker. And I told him I wasn't going to sell him one. And we went back down to the lake down there where that little, you cross the lake coming this way and then you got a little cutout there where people park. We went down there, it was good weather. And there was 6 or 8 people went down there that, I picked the people that I wanted to go down there. And they went, I showed them the call, they went down there and they listened to it and they said the same thing Darren did. So I started selecting people that I knew that would be interested in it. And I did that series for 4 years. And at the end of those 4 years, I stopped doing it. I tried to make some of those boxes. This is pertaining to wood. I've got some wood called cucumber. I've had for 15 years probably. That I got from Larry Prophet. I tried to make some boxes out of cucumber. I just knew that would work. It's in the magnolia family. It's like probably like working some of the mineral poplar. But I had all my blocks cut out, and I tuned up several blocks. I probably tuned up 6 blocks, ran paddles on them, and they were not exactly what I wanted them to be, but and then I finally got 2 or 3 of them that I wanted, that I was satisfied with, and then a month later, they had changed tone. They just didn't work. So I put those calls up and I stopped fooling with them. And I went back a year and a half later, and those calls were good calls. But they had changed from one thing to another thing and then changed back to what I had tuned them for originally.
You think that's because of the moisture content in the wood?
No, the wood had been dried 10 years inside my shop. That didn't have anything to do with it. I've had walnut calls change tone briefly, and they'll go right back. That could be moisture content or not. I don't know.
A little humid day or something like that?
I'm sorry?
A very humid day
Yeah. And in Florida, it's very humid.
all the time.
Very humid. But that's pretty much the story of the Williams box. Let me say this. I think I've already told you this, but one thing we don't have today that we need drastically is people to come up with new designs. There's 2 or 3 people in this building that have come up with new designs. Darren's one of them with his one-sider, with his scratch box. And others might have, they just don't have those calls here. I see the same calls year in, year out. I don't see any changes. So, and I don't know why. And you think Darren's one-sider, how long had a single side call been in existence that nobody ever thought to cut the paddle out and keep the screw hole centered rather than offset in the end block? You just think of the hundreds of thousands of people that have seen or used those Lynch calls or some other one-sider, and they make them like I do or like Lynch made them without that cutout. That people just don't think outside of the box. They're pleased with where they are, and they continue in that same direction, and it works for them, and that's good. But we need new designs. Larry Stevens has got a new design in his half box. But they're out there. You just got to think. I'm not coming out with any more new designs. I'm done. Anybody else?
Yeah. Could you talk about what you found as far as effect on sound on your boxes? Looking at end grain orientation on the body and the lid.
On the end grain, I want the end grain to be running from one side to the other at like a 45-degree angle, something like this, or even to what I call flat grain, which is it's equal all the way. I mean, one side is no different than the other.
Right.
But that's what I look for. I've got a call up here. You'll see it. I just noticed it's one of those handle boxes. I got the grain running almost vertical, and how I got away with that, I don't know. But you don't get away with that most of the time. It's just you just don't. But that's what I look for. Same thing on paddles. I look for quartering grain on paddles. If I want, let's say the old hen on this side and the young hen on this side, I want that grain quartering. And this paddle, I've never had anything good that came from vertical grain paddle. They don't work for me. All my calls for the most part are cut on a 5-degree angle on my bodies. And it just doesn't work for me. It might work for other call makers, that's fine, but it doesn't work for me. But that's what I look for.
On the lid, you don't want it straight vertical, you want some angle.
I want an angle on it, I do, because that's going to grab. If you got vertical grain, it might grab on the right side, but it won't grab on the left, or vice versa. It just depends on which way you turn the body of your call to get the particular sound you're looking for. But that's important. That end grain in that paddle and end grain in that body is very important for tonal quality. Anybody else?
Mr. Lamar, I just want to tell a little bit here. When Russell and I started this show 10 years ago, Mr. Lamar was one of the first ones that I called because I knew that he had used to come to this show all the time. And one little thing I will tell you that he kind of touched on a while ago, if you got a man's call, and if it don't play the way that you want it to play, send it back to him. Always do that. Don't tinker with a man's call. But anyway, Mr. Lamar has been real good about coming. He and Darren both, I called both of them, and they said, sure, we'll give it a try, But anyway, I just want to thank you for all that you've done and all that you mean to this show and bring to it.
Well, thank you
Yes,
so
sir.
much, Mark. I appreciate it. I love it. As long as I can continue to come, I will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we enjoy having you.
I do, and I'll be here as long as I can. These are the first boxes that I made. They don't sound anything like today. Don't sound bad.
One of the interesting things is I'm a collector and a hunter, and finding an old Lamar call. I had one on the table the other day from 1989, and I've seen this. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. He'll pick that call and start playing it. He's got his head down, and you just see this little smile break across his face because it sounds like he did when he sent it out.
Lamar, did you ever fool with glue boxes? Did you start with glue boxes?
Yeah.
Because that's how I started.
Yeah.
I have a glue box from back in 1981 or 82, one of my first boxes. And it was a glue box. And then I went from glue to the Hume box.
That's what I did. But I never was real pleased with glued boxes.
Cause back then, like Ben Lee was one of the guys, you know, and that's why I had a twin end from Ben Lee.
I
Something
have no
pretty
idea what we're
archived.
gonna get here. I'd hunt with that any day.
Yeah, I'd hunt that any day myself.
Anybody would.
20 boxes, Lamar.
Okay. Now that latex on that tube cover, I'm sure. is
I'm
not
sure
really
it's
good
tired.
shape. It's been here about 25 or 30 years.
Yeah, I'm sure it's
Longer than
tired.
that, longer than that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's pretty tired.
If you can get that back together for me.
Now, what year is that box here, Lamar?
83, November.
That's pretty good for 42 years old.
Handle boxes.
Now, this one here has a cherry lid,
Yeah. Cherry.
cherry lid poplar,
I'm sorry.
poplar.
Yes, sir. That side's not real good.
Mr. Lamar, you told me one time that you designed your calls to play different than Neil's. One played ahead of the arc and one played behind the arc. You know,
Yeah. Neil's calls, to begin with, when I first met him, those calls to me were running center or either a little bit forward. But Neil, now he'd been, I don't know when Neil made his first box, 75 or something, or early 70s. Joey, you know?
I knew it was the 70s, I
Yeah.
think like
But
around 75 or just a little bit later.
yeah, but he his, you know, I designed mine different. As I said, I reduced the size, and I designed this to move to run on the back, or the back of the center of the radius, because it sounded better.
Great job.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you. I used to make, along with that, I used to make leather holsters. For years I made leather holsters, time consuming, everything,
Were you tanning the leather yourself?
No, I wasn't tanning the
Okay.
leather. I'd eventually tan leather, and I would, of course, it's all hand stitched.
Yeah.
At one time, and I guess a lot of call makers, you're in everything. I wasn't sticking with box
Yeah,
calls, I was making all these different kind of calls.
Tube calls.
Buying dental down for tube calls, and so forth. And it was
Yep.
in '81 when I met him at the hotel to take him fishing. We were talking before we went out, and he'd been over my table at that show and said, "You need to think about going to solid body construction." Where I lived, I had a difficult time just getting wood, period. And no walnut, it was cherry,
Yeah.
so See, that's cherry paddle, that's cherry paddle. Walnut paddle, most of the walnut I get from Neil. When I go see Neil or something, he might have something, he gives to me.
Right.
So that's just the way it works. And then when I would go see him, go hunt with him, or just go visit with him, I'd go up there sometimes 3 times a year, sometimes 4 times a year, depending. He'd come hunt with me, it just depends. But I went at least a couple of times a year to see him and stay for a number of days at a time. But we would go to Greenville, and back then, you could go to those hardwood dealers, and man, they had select grade lumber there and you could just buy, you go for 3 or 4 boards, and you could get what you wanted, 4 or 5 boards, you could buy Honduras mahogany there.
Yeah.
It was just different. Had I probably didn't have the money,
Right.
but back then, had I known then what I know now, I would have hoarded a lot of that. But it's just something.
Cause like you, my first call that I made was a scratch box.
Yeah.
Then I went to a glue box from there, and then to a human box. It's funny how it seems like everybody's, you take steps.
Well, and two, when you get into,
Cause I never had anybody teach me nothing. Everything I learned on my own.
Well, Neil would teach me to a point, but he can't teach me.
Well, he made you learn.
Yeah,
He made you.
that's exactly what.
When you got that smile on your face, it was like the epiphany. It's like, that's what it takes.
And he and I would tune calls in his living room. I never saw him tune a call in his shop. All the years I knew him, they were tuned in his living room, and he had a rocking chair and a stool and a waste basket. And he'd sit there and he'd chisel that call. He'd dump it in that waste basket. Now, very seldom did he sand anything inside, unless it was a paddle that he thought might need to be sanded. But and we would share things, about what we. And I don't remember what those things were, but we would share about just making the boxes and the wood and so forth. And when I met Neil in the first several years, he was using a number 12 cadmium plated screw. And I was using a number 10 brass screw. And sometimes I'd use a number 10 bronze screw. And then a number of years later, I just went to stainless steel. But I got away from brass because, and it was particularly so with paddle calls. If you get a brass screw, you glue it in and you try to back it out, it's gonna break off or it's gonna bend. And you're not gonna do that with bronze, or you're not gonna do that with stainless. Because when I'm finished with a call, getting ready to spray it and put the paddle back on it, I put a little bit of glue there to glue that in its place, because hunters are tinkerers. And they think that they can tune it better than the person that made it, and that's okay. I'm probably guilty of that myself if I wasn't making them. But so he went to number 10 screws. He gave me that box of cadmium. I still got that box of screws at the house. That's a half a box. There must be 300 or 400 screws in that box. But he was some of the things I can't talk about.
Listening to Lamar talk about his early start in call making and all like that, a lot of things I didn't really know. And it just kind of reaffirmed that the guy's just a treasure. A guy we're so lucky to have around and learn from and be able to talk to and even call a friend.
I learned that it's going to be a long, difficult process, going to take a lot of time, and that I learned that I've got everything at the house that I need to get started, and a little bit about wood selection, about how to cut them, what to use. There was a lot of great information.